We will have a couple of additions for our format today. First, my name is Jan Driscoll. I'm a Senior Account Director at Catapult New Business. And Catapult is actually a sister company to the list online. As a group of companies, we work closely with the list to offer agency clients customized new business solutions that drive results. Within our network, we also have the Daily Vista and Agency Squared, who also provide complementary services. So a little bit more about me for a second so that you get some basis for the actual positioning of today's content. For the past 6 years, I have done proactive outbound new business development and strategic positioning at Catapult for global mid-sized agencies as well as boutique agencies in the U.S. and Canada. During today's presentation, we do have a large number of attendees on the line, so we do have everyone muted. At the end of the webinar, we are going to do a question and answer session. On your screen, you should have a chat box, and if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them during the webinar, and we will answer those questions at the end. Our goal today is to provide you with a detailed look at the Canadian anti-spam law and give you some guidance on how best to approach a proactive stance when prospecting in Canada. So let's get started, and we will breeze through this probably in about 45 minutes, but again, we want to leave some time for questions at the end. Okay, so what is the Canadian anti-spam law? It went into effect on July 1st, 2014. It was designed to reduce the amount of unsolicited spam email that Canadian citizens and businesses were receiving. It impacts every business and every single person who is in Canada. The law is governed by 3 Canadian agencies. They're all government agencies. And the first is the Canadian Television, Radio, and Telecommunications Bureau. The second, the Canadian Competition Bureau. And the third is the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. So under CASL, it had a 36-month transition period where you could continue to reach out to prospects that you were doing business with or were communicating with prior to July 1. The CASL governing board, so the 3 agencies, are not expected to start to levy any fines until 2015. One note, the fines are going to be pretty heavy. A couple of things that, lawmakers have made it clear that non-compliance fines will be heavy. They're going to range from $10,000 to $10 million. Just as an awareness point, the 3 governing bodies are not just going to look at companies that are large in size. They are looking at small and mid-sized companies. They will be targeting individuals. So what does CASL actually cover? Most people believe that CASL covers just email messages. It does. However, the law also covers any e-marketing campaigns that are branded campaigns, email solicitation campaigns for your products or services, or anything that's not directly sought out by a prospect or a consumer. Not widely known with the coverage of the law is that SMS mobile marketing campaigns are also covered. Yes, I said mobile. If you've not gotten their consent prior to July 1 of this year, your mobile campaign is in breach of the new law. Instant messaging and automated phone messages to computers and phones in Canada are also covered as being non-compliant under the law. And this is also not widely known by most people. The law also covers instant messaging via a social network. You may have in the past reached out to a prospect with a private message on a social network. You can no longer do that. You can, however, post a general message about your business on your company's main page. Canadian anti-spam also covers consumers and businesses from receiving mass robo-messages as well. So let's talk about the 3 types of consent that are covered underneath the Canadian anti-spam law. The 3 types are expressed, implied, and denied. Expressed is obviously the one that you want to go with. It's the one that gives you permission to continue your marketing, continue your communication. This really means that the recipient has actively sought out your business or service. They have given you their agreement to receive your information. In the process of receiving that information and getting that consent, you want to keep a couple of things in mind. First and foremost, you must always give them the option to opt in or opt out. Secondly, make a statement as to why you're contacting them. What's your purpose? What's the goal? Identify clearly who you are. This means name, phone number, contact information, company, address, and so on. Find a way to be able to verify the consent. A lot of phones right now, you do have the ability to record conversations. That really, from the perspective of the law, is the best way to gain consent. But make sure you have a verifiable way. If it is not by a recorded phone call, make sure that it is written with a timestamp on it. Have an understanding between the two of you that either party can withdraw their consent at any given time. So if the prospect decides that they want to opt out, if you decide that you do no longer wish to contact them, you may opt them out as well. The other two types of consent are implied. And that really means that the recipient has not necessarily given their express consent, but maybe they've inferred it by signs or actions. An example of this may be that if you had sent them an email prior to July 1, and let's say they opened it but didn't necessarily respond, that would kind of be implied consent. Maybe they attended something that an event that you held. That would kind of be implied consent. Denied consent means the recipient has given you express instructions to not contact them at all. That means that they have opted out and you must remove them from your list. So let's talk about liability and location. And this will start to give you some great idea as to where the liability is and culpability underneath the law. There is no culpability on terms of the recipient. You really have the law designed to cover the recipient and not the sender. Compliance from a single individual, for instance, does not give you total compliance with the company. You only have consent or compliance with that individual person. An example of this is if you are calling on Kraft in Canada and you have consent from the Chief Marketing Officer. It does not mean that every other person, brand manager, SVP, media person, that you have consent to outreach to them, and does not mean that you have their compliance. The compliance lies only with the individual. So under the law, there really is no difference between an employee who works for a Canadian company in Canada that has a .ca email versus a Canadian employee at a company in Canada that has a .com email. You really want to make sure that most companies do not use .ca emails anymore. The majority of them are .com. You must be really, really careful and make sure that you verify their location. Location becomes really, really critical in the new guidelines of the law. So just as an example, let's say you've had a contact and that contact has been in New York City. He's been your contact for a couple of years. You have a working relationship. He gets promoted and he has moved from New York to Toronto. Not a big deal, right? Well, actually it is. You really must re-verify his consent, his or her consent, now that they are in Canada. So, let's be cautious of that. Even though you have a working relationship, the sheer fact that he resides in Canada makes a difference. Another really recent example of this that's a good sort of situational example is Burger King, as most of you know, bought Tim Hortons. They are moving their global operations to Canada for tax purposes, but they are moving their corporate offices. This is a good example of that, if you're going from a situation where the company is moving itself, and let's say they keep a regional office in Chicago, if the corporate office is in Canada and you are emailing somebody who works for Burger King still and resides in the U.S., because that email has to go through a filter that is in Canada, it does fall underneath the covenants of the law. So part of that is that it has to go from your email to Burger King server in Canada and back to the U.S. So CASL, as you know, started off on July 1. It was Canadian Independence Day, oddly enough. By July 4th, there were more than 1,000 complaints that had been filed already with the 3 governing bodies over the law. And, you know, clearly that was an indication to a lot of people, and certainly the Canadian government, that Canadians want to change. They were ready to embrace this new law. They saw some benefits to it. So I just have a quick little story to share with you, and I know this is an odd sort of combination of images on the screen, but they do all relate to one another. As I mentioned earlier, I work with Catapult New Business here in Atlanta, and that we are an outsourced new business resource for agencies and marketing services firms. Our job is to go in and work with agencies to create proactive strategies for new business development. We also actively build prospect pipelines for the agencies that we work with. We create opportunities and build a sustainable pipeline for them. So shortly after CASL went into effect, I was doing some outbound calling for a Canadian agency that I work with at Catapult. And one of the CMOs that I got on the phone was from a major Canadian retailer, a very well-known brand. And she had shared some really interesting things with me about the initial effects of the law. And this is where the graphics on the screen come into play. What she shared with me first is that prior to the days leading up to July 1, the last few days of June, she had gotten 500 emails from companies that were soliciting her consent to continue to email her after the Canadian spam law went into effect on July 1. She also shared that within that first week of the law going into effect, that she was getting an average of 50 phone calls a day from marketers who were trying to call her now as opposed to email her. They were agencies and B2B service providers. Quite simply, what she told me is that her phone was ringing, and she literally stopped answering it. She said to me, "I delete all of those messages." She then went on to tell me that a lot of what she and her colleagues are now going to do, and I assume this is going to increase in popularity across a lot of other companies, is that they are now having their company issue them a secondary phone line. So the first phone line that they have, the original, will receive the bevy of junk calls that they get. And then the second one is really going to be a true direct line, and that will be the line that they share with colleagues and business partners that they do want to talk to, that they're actively participating with. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about which Canadian contacts we can continue to email. Those, as I mentioned earlier, that you have an active business relationship with. Those are, you know, clear contacts. You've got business going on. There's no really question that could come into play, no gray area as to what the relationship is. The second one is those that are published emails. And some good examples of that are really people whose names appear on press releases that are in the public, media contacts on websites, names and email addresses, let's say, on annual reports. One distinction here that is really important to remember is that a publication on a social media site does not count. So if someone publishes their email on a social media site, that is covered as being non-compliant with the law. LinkedIn is probably the biggest example of that. In order for it to be compliant under CASL, you must actually be connected to that person. So kind of bear that in mind moving forward. Someone whose business activities are relevant to the message you're sending without indicating that they don't want to receive your message. So as an example of this, if you're calling into maybe Target in Canada, and the message of the person that you have reached out to says, please leave a message here or feel free to email me at, and they give their email address. That is an indication that they are giving you consent to reach out to them. So you have perfect permission under that because you're sending them a relevant message. They don't know whether they want to accept it yet or not. So it does kind of cover that gray area. Those folks who seek out your services via your website. So everybody should have a landing page that they created prior to July 1. If you haven't done it, probably a good idea to create it. And create it so that it is a consent page. And easy place for people to go to your website, give their consent so that you can continue to outreach to those people in Canada. Family and friends are also exempt under the law, and certainly there are probably family and friends that we'd like to be able to block, but we all have those that we want to keep in contact with, so that's okay. Emails that are captured within a limited access or confidential account. Great examples of these would be bank accounts or security accounts where they actively have to communicate with you in order to maintain the account. Remember, as any email that you're sending, every single email must have the opportunity for your recipient to opt out. Remember, you can cancel the relationship at any time. They can cancel the relationship at any time. So let's talk about what else is okay. Calls to express consent. You should have your list of people who gave you the okay prior to July 1 to continue to reach out to them. Those are free game. You have their consent. You can contact them. You can email them. You're good to go. Direct mail is also a really great way to continue to reach out. Put some time into creating a well-rounded DM strategy. You'll likely find that it's going to be pretty effective for you. One really important point right now is build a strong SEO, SEM plan. This could be the thing that has the single biggest impact on how strong your new business efforts are moving forward. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Join, network at local events, network at trade shows and conferences. A lot of Canadian agencies that I have talked to have upped their budgets for trade shows and conferences, particularly towards the end of this year and into 2015, simply because it gives them a much better trigger mechanism for sparking a conversation with a prospect. One really great example of that would be the store retail show that happens in June in Toronto. That's a really good example of a great trade show where there are a lot of corporate marketers and a lot of agencies intermingling for a couple of days. Look at joining associations that maybe your prospects are members of. Maybe it's a regional banking association. Maybe it's the local Kiwanis Club. Yes, some of that is not always fun and it is time consuming, but certainly a great way to connect. Start to leverage your network of personal connections, friends, colleagues, people that you maybe are linked into already. Leverage those introductions, spark a conversation. I know, as I mentioned earlier, LinkedIn with public emails, people who publish their emails, is not permitted. Having someone introduce you to someone in Canada and start the connection and you link with is perfectly okay as long as you're doing it through an existing connection. So if someone gives you a business card at an event, is that okay? Accept the business card. Write the date on the back of the card, the date and time, event, and the location. If possible, have someone else initial it. You're going to need a proof point if it ever comes up in the future under a complaint that has been filed. It is a great way to gain that consent, or simply just ask the person you're talking to email you, or ask them to go to your website and fill out the form on the landing page to give their consent. Make sure that even though you're meeting them in a casual situation, you are still following the proper guidelines to gain their consent. So what can't you do now? As we mentioned earlier, you cannot send any broad-based emails without consent. You can't send customized one-to-one emails that are sort of friendly without that person's consent. You cannot simply switch from an e-marketing campaign to an SMS campaign. You just can't do it. The SMS, as we mentioned earlier, is covered under the law, so that would put you in breach. You cannot electronically collect addresses via software programs. There are a number of software programs out there that actually harvest email addresses. Good examples of that are programs called SoftTab and WinSite. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot do private messaging and directive contact on social media. You can only do broad-based messaging via social media now. So this kind of takes us to a fork in the road. Your job is to grow new business in the U.S. and Canada. You've got hand raisers that you have to find, vital prospects who want to find you, and the new business road that you're traveling on now sort of has a split in it. You really have to kind of think about splitting your overall plan into two. Maybe you can call one of them a U plan that's focused specifically on the United States. That's probably likely your original plan, the plan you've been working for the last 8 or 9 months. The second plan you may want to consider, you could label a C plan, and tailor that one specifically to reaching Canadian prospects. Give some good thought as to what the best approach is. If you had decent content and marketing calendar devised before a CASL went into effect, losing email marketing should not have that much of an impact or be detrimental to your success from a prospecting standpoint. A couple of tweaks here and there, you should be able to move forward under the guidelines. And the reality is that our job as marketers is to create an emotional connection, to connect with those people with relevant information and give them a relatable point that's going to propel them to give you consent, propel them to act, propel them to interact, not just once, but over and over. So we've now entered mission critical for a lot of folks. And what are some things that you can do? You can shore up the content on your website. As we talked about earlier, SEO and SEM plans are much more critical now. And great website content is probably the single best way that you can handle that. I know we all hear about usability with retail and e-commerce websites. The further that we get into CASL, the more we're going to hear about usability of media, marketing, and tech sites. It's time-consuming to redo a website. It's expensive. But don't miss that opportunity to beef up the content on your website or optimize your website by completely redoing it. Those could be critical touch points for you moving forward now that you can no longer mass email under CASL. Build out some case studies and thought leadership. I'll talk about these here in a couple of minutes as to how they become much more relevant for you. As I mentioned, develop a solid SEO, SEM plan. Your inbound marketing just became hypercritical. Make sure that you're getting results. Make sure that you have every avenue covered from an SEO, SEM standpoint. Go back and again, leverage association and group memberships and contacts. Start to build a referral program. You have existing clients right now. If you're not tapping into referrals from them, this is a really good time to do it. We'll now talk for a couple of minutes about data and contacts. And, prior to July 1, you should have gone through and really scrubbed your lists, subdivided out the people you had consent and didn't have consent from. Accurate contact data right now is at the forefront of what you should be concerned about. So look at scrubbing your list. Identify everybody that has expressed consent. Identify those people that you wish to pursue and potentially gain consent from in the future. One thing to really look at is weed out the overflow. Quality over quantity. And when you're reviewing those lists, there's a couple of tips to be very careful on so that you make sure that you're removing those Canadian contacts from your overall list. Look at the .ca in their email. Look at the zip code. Look at the area code. Look at the city that they're in. Look at the title that they have. Some folks may have a title of Senior Vice President of Marketing, Canadian Division East. Look at those titles. That's a good way to catch that. You know, another good stop point on that from a verification is have other people look at the list. As we all know, when we've looked at a large data list, you can look at it over and over, and sometimes it gets a little blurry and you miss some things that potentially could be obvious. So share those lists. Have some other folks help you scrub them. Refresh your data. Gather some new data. Having worked at Catapult for more than 6 years, I have used the list online every day, religiously. Yes, it's a sister company to Catapult, but you know, without a doubt, it is the best data source that's out there. Not only did the list prepare for CASL by re-verifying all of their Canadian contacts prior to July 1, they really made an effort to secure some direct dials for those contacts. And this is a big one. And you know, reliability of data is critical. The list online went through, and they have a solid verification process for every contact in their database. All contacts are reconfirmed and verified every 120 days. A couple of other good data sources that are out there are Redbooks and data.com. And again, go back and mine your current and existing connections. Don't sort of let those go and don't pay attention to them thinking they're not fruitful. So here's a great situation. You thought that you were going to you know, continue to call and do some outbound prospecting now that you can no longer email. And you know, that's okay under the new law. But what happens if somebody actually answers the phone? You rang them up. You thought maybe you were going to get their voicemail, but they answered. So now what? First, make sure it's a good time. Make sure that they have time to talk for a couple of minutes. Begin the process by identifying yourself, name, company, title. State your objective. Tell them why you're calling. If it is to gain consent under CASL, tell them that. Tell them you'd like to reach out to them with other relevant pieces for your brand or your product. Don't get too deep into your value proposition. Keep it very surface until they give you the okay. If they give you the okay verbally and you have it recorded, that's fine. You're good, start talking to them, sell all you want. If you cannot capture that consent while they're on the phone or capture it in a recorded manner, ask them to send a link, while you're on the phone with them, send them a link to your landing page. Have them fill out the consent form right then and there. Or simply ask them to send you a good old-fashioned fax if they still have a fax machine. So, you know, once you have their consent, you can start your lead nurture process. You can start to align what content you want to reach them with, how frequently, what those touch points are going to be, and kind of weave them into your overall new business strategy. So this is where, as we talked about earlier, shoring up your website and starting to gather case studies and thought leadership, this is where that comes in handy. If you've had them on the phone, you have a relevant touch point, you have their consent, you're good to go right away. You can jump right out of the gate and go. So one of the last things that we want to cover is, you know, circling back on the topic of non-compliance. As I mentioned, fines are expected to be steep and levied against non-compliant companies of all sizes. The three governing bodies have made it very clear over and over in countless articles and interviews that, you know, non-compliance fines could be as high as $10 million. You should be self-patrolling yourself. Make sure that you have a process. Make sure that your staff knows what's going on. Make sure your staff understands CASL. Take the time and really go back and look at it and create a process for updating your contacts. Mend areas where you may have potential gaps that could be questionable under the compliance guidelines. Continually educate everybody. Make sure everybody knows. If you are notified of a violation, first and foremost, call your legal counsel. Get them involved. Start internally to gather any materials that relate to the particular complaint. That includes demonstrating for yourself that you did due diligence in order to comply to the law. Capture the recording, capture the web form, capture the email they sent you, whatever that proof point is, make sure that you have it. And also make sure that you can establish for them, for the government or the review board, make sure you can establish for them what steps you took to comply to CASL as a company. Not just that one particular person, what you have done from a global perspective as a company to remain in compliance after July 1st. This last point on here, remember that your recipients have the option to draw civil action against you. Yes, you sent it to their corporate email. Yes, you are in violation under the law to the corporation. Because you had the consent of that individual person, they have the option to draw civil action against you. So be very cognizant of that. It's not just the fine that one of the government agencies can levy against you. It is a civil action case potential as well. So one just final point is, you know, we're all into business development. We all have budgets and goals that we need to hit for pipelines and close business for the year to keep things moving forward. Learn the law, keep it in your understanding, keep it in the forefront of your thoughts as you're prospecting in Canada, and carry on, keep selling, keep selling. So what's going to happen in 2015 and beyond? You know, the audience right now is sort of hypersensitive. It's been in the media. It was a big deal in the U.S. It was a big deal in Canada. Canadian publications, television, radio, media outlets are all still talking about it. It's been a couple of months, but it has been somewhat disruptive. So people are hypersensitive to it now. So I think we're going to see complaints that are going to really sort of start increasing at a rapid pace. You know, fines are going to start happening far and wide beginning in January. And, you know, those fines, $10,000 to $10 million, that's a lot of money for a company to absorb, particularly one that's not large in size. The governing bodies, you know, they're not just going to look at companies that are large. I think we mentioned earlier that, you know, we talked about looking at small companies. We looked at mid-sized companies. They are going to be looking at individuals. They could and likely will be looking at you. So how is this going to impact business in Canada? You know, really it's going to, as it goes on longer, it's going to have a much more significant impact on Canadian businesses the further that it goes. Canadian marketing already lags behind the U.S. and other countries by about 18 months. And taking out a channel like email will have some residual impact. So I think you're going to see marketers start to embrace new ways to connect with people. You may see an increase, let's say, of events. You may see an increase in contesting of some kind. Things like that were let's say, mainstays years ago, but in the digital age sort of fell off. I think we're also going to see a lot of more public and private uprisings. As CASL stays in the news, you know, the public will continue to rally behind it. It is a law designed for Canadian citizens. On the flip side, the more that it stays in the news, the more expected backlash I think we're going to see from business owners and marketers. You know, as of July 1, the law really changed their purvey and their goal. That fork is in the road. It is putting a ripple in how they're traveling down the highway. You know, also in the news is that there are a lot of other countries that are looking at adopting. Canada was the first. They've taken that pretty staunch anti-spam law and put it into effect. And there's chatter about other countries sort of following suit. France and Italy are two notable countries that have some discussion. That may be a few years off before other countries start to adopt, but it is possible that it is going to spread. It is unlikely that the U.S. will adopt something like that because it could have some pretty significant economic impacts for not only for businesses but for individuals if it were adopted on a broad scale in the U.S. So a few housekeeping items before we get to our question and answer portion. As you're navigating the new Canadian anti-spam landscape in the coming weeks, feel free to contact us. You can reach out to me directly. There's my contact info there on the screen. Or you can reach out to the team at the list online. Our experts will be happy to talk with you and help clarify any details that you might be struggling with. So to help you get started, all of you who are attending, to help you get started with your Canadian prospecting, the list is going to be providing each of you who attended today with a complimentary trial of the U.S. and Canadian list databases. We want to keep an eye out for more details on that. We will be sending a follow-up email after the webinar and give you some guidelines as to things that you can do, and you can get familiar with Canadian contacts, and particularly some of that information that I talked about that was updated in the list recently. So we're going to get started with our question and answer section, and I've seen we've got a few folks who have typed in their questions. The first one is that, what if I'm working as a contractor for a business and I breach CASL? Where is the liability? Great question, and I'll have that in really a three-part answer. Before you start as a contractor, you should have talked to your business about prospecting in Canada and about being covered under CASL. And as we talked about a couple of minutes ago, the company is liable. The company you're representing is liable. They will be the one who has to pay the fine, whatever that fine may be. You then are also liable from a personal standpoint. If the person who received the email filed the complaint does decide to file a civil suit against you. So don't make a mistake and jeopardize what could potentially be a great business relationship or a business relationship that you've had for a long time. Here's another question. Our second question is, can someone else give consent for another person? An assistant, for instance, cannot give permission for a decision maker. The answer is no, no, no. You cannot have anybody else give permission for you. You may not gain consent from the actual person themselves through a third party. The person that you're speaking with, so the assistant, they can give you permission and consent to contact them. You may forward your information to them. They, in turn, can forward it to the decision maker. That's perfectly fine under the law, but the assistant cannot give consent for you to directly email the decision maker. The third question we have is, does CASL only apply to marketers and businesses in the U.S.? And the answer to that is no. CASL covers all of the channels like email that we talked about in the webinar for everyone globally. So people in France, people in the UK who are doing business or prospecting or reaching into Canadian contacts, everyone globally must be in compliance under the CASL law. So our fourth question is, how frequently should I scrub a data list of expressed consents? Making sure that you continue to scrub your list should always be at the forefront. You should look at that list frequently and often, and have it be part of your natural process. Create a process and a timeline for refreshing that data. One of the best ways is upload a research paper to your website, have people download it. That can continue to string along those people who are under the express consent. Send a verification email. It can be that simple. Send a re-verification email. Maybe you do it biannually, maybe you do it annually. It really should be done more frequently than that, but that would be certainly acceptable under the covenants of the law. So our next question says, I'm a part of a demand generation team. How does using a list like the list cover me as an individual when the consent for those emails has been obtained generically? When you're using a data source like the list, you are not buying the consent of the person. You are only buying the data. So you are buying the information that would enable you, after you get consent from them through your normal channels, to email them. So it does not give you automatic consent to just buy the list, buy the data from the list, for instance, and email them. You must go through the process of getting them to give consent. So our next question is, can one prospect a Canadian contact via social media direct messaging? Twitter direct messaging, Facebook message? No. This is what I referred to earlier as social media. I think we used the example of Facebook, and no, you may not do that. You cannot instant message anyone on social media. You cannot connect with them at all without it being a connective point for you, where you are connected to them socially. But you also then must make sure that any social media information you're putting out there is more generic in its content. So our next question is a connection on LinkedIn considered express or implied consent? It is considered express consent if you connected to them prior to July 1. If it is after July 1 and you were introduced, it really sort of falls in that implied consent until you continue to have other business relationships with them, until you are expanding that relationship, maybe with a meeting, maybe with a couple of phone calls, perhaps with a couple of email exchanges. So that's a tricky one there, but certainly one to be mindful of. Okay, so that concludes our presentation today. Again, if you have any questions that were not answered, please feel free to reach out to me directly or the folks at the list. You will be getting a follow-up email. We also are going to be sending out a recorded version of this webinar to you so you can share it or listen to it again. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great afternoon.